Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hudson Institute here in Washington, D.C. For those of you visiting us for the first time, we're a 501c3 think tank devoted to enhancing US global leadership for prosperity and security around the world. My name's Nate Sibley. I'm a research fellow here at Hudson, and I run something called the Kleptocracy Initiative, and we do policy research on countering corruption from authoritarian regimes. Today, we're going to be talking about countering Russian influence in the Republic of Georgia. Georgia was, of course, the first country to have what's now become known as a color revolution, the Rose Revolution in 2003, following which it embarked on a period of ambitious democratic reforms. Sadly, not sadly, but tragically, it was invaded by Russia in 2008, and 1/5 of its territory remains illegally occupied by Russia. There are also fears now in recent years that Georgia is being dragged further back into Russian influence under the current government, led by the Georgia Dream Party and its de facto leader, Bidzina Ivanishvili. They've adopted, especially in recent months, an increasingly hostile stance towards the EU and Western partners. They've expressed only sort of lukewarm support for Ukraine at times, and they've been putting opposition parties, independent media, and civil society under increasing pressure. Today, we're going to focus particularly, though, on whether this growing Russian influence could make the country a hub for money laundering and sanctions evasion in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, and what the implications of that might be also for Ukraine's fight for freedom. So this event is not only about Georgia, it is also about Ukraine. And I'm delighted I have an all-star panel here to discuss and examine these issues with me. First up, I'm delighted to welcome in person to Hudson Katya Dekanoidze. She is a member of Georgia's parliament. She's a former minister, and she's a former chief of Ukraine's national police. There are, of course, great bonds and ties between Ukraine and Georgia, and that even reflecting the fact that the officials often serve in different governments there. Next, we're going to be hearing from Ika Kagauri. She's the executive director of Transparency International Georgia. They've conducted some of the most detailed research into the nature and scope of Russian financial influence in the country. Then we'll be hearing from Josh Rudolph. He is the senior fellow, for malign finance at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracies. He has a background in finance. He served in many government roles here in the US, but he was most recently seconded to the US Agency for International Development, where he helped write the dekleptification report, in which Georgia was one of the main case studies. And last of all, we'll be hearing, we're delighted to have join us Elena Halushka. She's a board member at the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kyiv. Elena, like so many of her compatriots, has had to take some time out recently from doing the great anti-corruption work that she focused on primarily for so many years, and that we welcomed you to Hudson to talk about and discuss with us before, to focus on Ukraine's immediate needs of getting the weapons it needs, getting support it needs. That's what Elena will be here to talk about, and the implications of Georgia's growing Russian influence in Georgia for Ukraine. But I wonder, maybe we could start off with you, Katya, and maybe we could just go around everyone 5 minutes. You all bring a different perspective to this. You've done different research on this. But Katya, maybe you could kick off talking a bit about what this growing Russian influence means for politics and indeed for democracy in Georgia.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me here, and absolutely I'm so delighted to participate in very important meeting because everybody is talking that maybe in Washington and among our international partners there might be some kind of Georgian fatigue, but I don't agree because I know that Georgia had a lot of friends here in Washington especially, and United States is our internationally very strong strategic partner. So thank you very much. I want to welcome our friends also, Elena, Eka, Josh, and I definitely think that their participation is absolutely very important in this very important talk. Well, indeed. So this is very painful topic for me to talk about because I represent Georgia. I'm the member of the parliament, and also in this very challenging time when, especially after 24th of February, when there was a bloody aggression in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Georgia became some kind of very vivid example of very bad neutrality regarding Ukraine. And actually, Georgia became the example of what we had been talking about since 2012. So 2012, there was a peaceful transformation of power after the elections. And as you mentioned, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who created a huge coalition of the political parties, he came to the power. And actually, his foreign policy doctrine was, to gamble with Russia and Putin, and also to definitely be some kind of in a very, also to play with our Western partners, right? With the United States and European Union, they signed the associated agreement in 2014. But unfortunately, I mean, he and his government somehow managed to play and to stay in a gray zone, just not to be in a very on the Western direction, and just somehow to have this kind of propaganda that we don't want to irritate Putin. This is a propaganda still available in Georgia right now for GD. Yeah. So after February 24th, I mean, when there was a very thick red line between the civilization and the historically, very black part like Russia, I mean, GD and especially Ivanishvili, who is an oligarch, and by the way, he's an oligarch and last oligarch who managed to wash out all his money from Russia. He earned a lot of money in early 90s in Russia, and he's got some ties with Russian oligarchs which are sanctioned right now, and I'm sure Eka will mention that. But also, I mean, his essence of governing is absolutely Russian style. He's not a guy who definitely can play in accordance with Western rules and the values. So after the bloody invasion, I mean, the GD's approach to Ukraine was shameful. I have to admit. First of all, I mean, I worked in Ukraine, and I was a proud Ukrainian citizen as a chief of the National Police of Ukraine. And Ukraine, for me, it's not a country, our neighbor. Ukraine is a country which got a huge mission right now to destroy Putin and to destroy this evil empire. And I believe that the Soviet Union is collapsing right now. I mean, it didn't collapse back then. But to say frankly, I mean, when I've seen and when we had been observing the GD's approach to Ukraine, I mean, it was shameful, it was very painful, it was sensitive. And despite the fact that the Georgian government's approach to President Zelensky's and Ukrainian government was absolutely kind of, shameful, Georgian people, I mean, they supported Ukraine a lot. 85% of Georgian people considered that war in Ukraine and the Russian aggression in Ukraine, I mean, it was Georgia's war too. Because we suffered, in 2008, as you have mentioned, there was a huge invasion of Georgia too, and 25% of our territories is still occupied and under the occupation. So, and actually, I mean, after this bloody invasion, their Georgian government decided that the economy's growth, I mean, dependence growth on Russian economy is on place, because 10% of economic growth, as Georgian Prime Minister is saying every Monday when he's got the executive meeting, it means that there is a huge inflow of Russians and influx of Russians, and actually 300,000 Russians cross the border. Yeah. From Larsi. And, I mean, Georgians don't feel secure because of the, Russian speakers. For them is a kind of, it's not the immigration problem, but it's also the, very, very serious national security threat. This is first. Second, I mean, there's a huge remittance coming from Russia, and a lot of, and this money, I mean, money inflow to Russia, and a lot of companies registered, I mean, Russian companies, and unfortunately it is not available to trace the money. I mean, Russians are investing in Georgia. And also, since the dependence of Georgian economy to Russian economic growth, I mean, it's also the national security threat, but unfortunately, Georgian government doesn't consider so. Georgia did not join the international sanctions, and when we as an opposition, as civil society and the people, I mean, we had been requesting that, Georgian government, I mean, they used to say that, you want to impose new sanctions on Russia from Georgia. No, we wanted just Georgia to be in line of the civilized countries. That was so much important for us. I mean, they did not give the floor to President Zelensky in the Georgian parliament, but most of all, the huge national security threat is that the GD and the oligarchy and kleptocracy, as Joss mentioned in his report, is kind of huge threat for Georgia itself, but also it's a threat of regional security. Okay, so let's put it this way. We don't want Ukraine only to survive. We want Ukraine to win, and definitely, I mean, all of us, we have to work in that direction. Unfortunately, I mean, Georgia's kleptocracy and oligarchy and this government, I mean, under the shadow of pro-Russian and, you know, just Russian-style oligarch is a security threat for the whole international and regional security. I mean, starting from Black Sea security and the Black Sea and Baltic Sea, there must be the security belt for Ukraine. But unfortunately, I mean, this security belt can be very tight because of Georgia. I mean, because of this threat and this definitely very, you know, just absolutely shameful approach to Ukraine and Ukrainian security. I mean, Bidzina himself, he does not believe that the Ukraine can win and Ukraine will win. I mean, he definitely believes that you know, Putin is almighty and this is his essence. And I mean, his ruling and his government can't coexist with Western values and European Union. And as probably you mentioned it, but you know, I want to underline that because of GD and GD's anti-Western, you know, hysteria, we never got the candidacy status when Moldova and Ukraine got it. Yes. And I have to admit that I worked in both those countries, in Ukraine and Moldova, and I remember how Georgia was advanced. I mean, in advance. I mean, we had a lot of reforms, but unfortunately, those reforms right now are kind of backward than in Ukraine and Moldova. So, and also the huge threat also is that Georgia can become the, you know, some kind of law for international sanctions and the whole. For instance, just recently, Ukrainians, and it was a huge report, and probably I will stop there. Huge report done by Ukrainian Defense Ministry, analytical report saying that the Georgian air route, you know, is used by Iranians to deliver drones, drone kamikazes, and they're the second route through Caspian Sea. But also, I mean, Georgia can be somehow the, you know, just the, you know, our territory can be the threat for, you know, Ukrainians as to avoid the sanctions. This is kind of very important problem, but also that's why, I mean, internationally and talking to our partners, we ask that, well, Bidzina Ivanishvili is a person and his government is a government which can be the threat and is a threat for Ukrainian security and the regional security. So that's why, I mean, the personal sanctions on him, like it was done with to Plakhatnyuk and Shor, and we all know that the Shor was a person and is a person, and also Plakhatnyuk financing pro-Russian propaganda and the manifestations against Maya Sandu's government right now in Moldova. So, and actually it is a kind of leverage from in your hands and in the hands of our partners in order to definitely, you know, make a very strong statement and a warning to a person who is a threat for the regional security. Well, democratic government in Georgia and democracy in Georgia means a strong regional security and regarding Ukraine also. So I think I will stop here because, you know, I have to. I think that our guests also will deliver a very important information too. Sure. But I think that we have to work in that direction, and you know, this kind of discussions are so much important for delivering the message to, you know, our partners that well, Georgia is important. There can't be any issues. You know, just there must be some issues just solved internationally, and this is kind of the very strong warning, like EU's resolution just recently adopted in the European Parliament that, well, I mean, here we are, and every oligarch and the person who is a security for, who is a threat for security for Ukraine can be punished.
That's fantastic. You painted a very comprehensive introduction. Thank you, Katya, but also a very concerning picture. I wanted to dive a little deeper, Ika, with you on the research you've been doing. Could you tell us a bit about, you know, the nature of Russian sort of financial influence and how your research has sort of dug into that a bit? The floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Maybe we don't like really make this in-depth research on financial flows, but what I can do is to make a short overview about the business interests of our informal governor, Mr. Ivanishvili, who is the one who decides in Georgia, I would say, and we can elaborate on this as well and speak about his powers in Georgia. And then also maybe speak about the economic dependency on Russia, which also is the topic of discussions in Georgia now. So if we, let's start from the beginning, apparently. So in 2012, when there was this peaceful transfer of power, we all thought that this is also something really extraordinary in the region. And for many years, you can imagine that we were very much appreciated that we were the leading country in the region with our anti-corruption reforms, building the institutions and all that. So we thought that it will continue, and there will be additional kind of benefit for this trend in Georgia. However, at some point we have recognized that the things are not look so well, right? So because we have realized that apparently and now we have the proofs of this. Apparently, Bidzina Ivanishvili was lying to the Georgian public, saying that he actually sold all his assets in Russia, and apparently he does not have anything and any connections with Russia. So when we looked at the documentation, and several months ago, we actually published the report with all the documentations there. So we said that apparently, yes, he sold his assets. He sold the companies which were registered under his name, but apparently his offshore companies bought the same companies. And apparently between 2012 and 19, he had at least 10 Russian companies operating in Russia through his offshore companies. So as for today, Ivanishvili owns at least one company in Russia, which called Aquaspace, through one of his offshore companies again. So he has many companies, and I can list some of them. So one is Vanity Overseas Limited, another one is Wellminister SA, the third one is Venigen Management Limited. So many companies, many offshore companies, and it looks like he operates through his offshore companies, not only in Russia, but in Georgia as well. So what concerns us is that he not only has the business interest in Russia through his offshore companies, but also his relatives helps him to really have the tight connections with the very influential former and acting high officials in Russia. And so apparently he has two relatives. It is his brother and his cousin, and they own the common businesses with for instance, with the U.S. sanctioned former KGB general and governor of St. Petersburg, for instance, Georgy Poltavchenko. And in 2018, Putin appointed Poltavchenko as chair of the board of the directors of the largest state-owned company, United Shipbuilding Company. And he was actually sanctioned in 2022 by the US, and also sanctioned by European Union, Switzerland, Canada, and United Kingdom, and Ukraine as well. So another person with whom the family members of Ivanishvili has connections is Roland Kharyanov, and he's also official from Volgograd. He's high official from Volgograd, and his wife was the member of Russian Duma in 2021. And apparently, she is also sanctioned by Ukraine. So what I want to say is that we apparently think that it's not only his family members owning this business in Russia, right? So actually he uses his family members in order to have close ties with Russian high officials. And these individuals also are very influential in Georgia. For instance, the cousin of Mr. Ivanishvili actually used to be the deputy director of Georgia State Investment Fund, Partnership Fund. And also he's a shareholder of the company managing Bidzina Ivanishvili's private investment fund, Georgian Co-Investment Fund. So what I'm saying is that apparently there is this huge scheme where his relatives, himself, through his offshore companies are involved. I will stop with mentioning these companies, and you can, if you are interested in this, you can read our report. All the documentations are there. But for Georgian public, it's very difficult to imagine that Ivanishvili will be serving Georgia's interests when having so many business interests and having so many connections with the influential high officials in Russia. And when it comes to the issue of Georgia's integration in NATO and EU, for me, it's just very hard to imagine that he will be doing everything, for Georgia to reach this goal. So when it comes to Georgia's economic dependency on Russia, we were looking at these tendencies. First of all, after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, 9,000 additional companies were registered, Russian companies were registered in Georgia. So you know that many Russians entered Georgia, so they stayed here, they rent the apartment, they started businesses here. So they enjoy life being in this petty corruption-free country that we were building for many years. So, but in addition, if you look at the export, so it's increasing. So the export dependency on Russia is increasing, but especially warning is the import. And the import is increasing, especially in particular areas is increasing. What we say, and because it is also very often used by the Russian propaganda and the Georgian government's propaganda, so they build on this. So what we say, so yes, our economy is dependent on Russia, but it is not so critical that we can't live independently. If the particular decisions will be taken as soon as possible, it's possible for us to develop our economy without being dependent on them. But for this, we need the particular decisions from the government, and we don't see these decisions, right? So the only thing that we see is that there's strong propaganda saying that, we have to be afraid of Russians, they might invade. The US and the EU is asking Georgia or force Georgia to drag in war with Russia. And we will, we will not survive if Russians, if we don't live together with Russians and if we don't cooperate with them. So this is the general line that we see and the general message box that we hear from the officials all the time. So now the question is what to do with this. And I should say that at this moment, we don't really have the proved kind of cases when someone official is helping Russian oligarchs to avoid the sanctions. There are some allegations. I think that it might be happening, but still for the civil society and for the political parties, it's very difficult to identify this. We need the coordinated approach where our Western partners are involved as well. right? So otherwise it will be, for us especially, it will be very difficult to identify such cases. We just can't speak about the statistics and all these kind of things, but it's not enough. So, and then the second question is what to do with the current Georgia situation, right? Because we are in the trouble here. So today we were listening some statements from the side of the ruling party. I would say there are some splits, but it's not the split. Like, you know, it's just a they play their cards like this, but it's not really serious. So we heard from them that, you know, they might introduce some restrictions for funding of the NGOs, right? So this is like, you know, and every day you just listen this traditional Russian message boxes that's like, you know, in the messages that, you know, how terrible the civil society is, that we are the US agents and the EU agents, and we undermine the state interest. So that's where we are, but I don't really see concrete policy from our Western partners, I would say, how to deal with this complicated situation. Because from one side, of course, we Georgian people think that we should get the status, that we should be closer to the EU and NATO, but from the other side, we have particular individuals, and especially one who is resisting to the development of our country. And we don't see the like really clear understanding that it is so big threat for us. And maybe at some point it might be too late to do something with this. And now it's the moment when everyone should act.
Well,
Thank
you so much, Chika.
Yeah.
We're getting on for time, so I'm going to jump in. Someone who has been thinking about what Western policy towards Georgia really ought to be, because you painted a picture whereby you say you don't have quite the proof yet that sanctions, evasion, smuggling, and so on are going on the scale that they seem to be. You know, the circumstances you described, it'd be very surprising if they weren't going on. And that you need more Western coordination and input to help uncover those schemes if they are indeed going on. Someone who's been, as I said, been thinking about that a great deal in the past few months is Josh Rudolph. So Josh, maybe I could turn over to you for the next few minutes just to talk about what you've been doing on this front.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nate. And that was fascinating. You know, even as an avid reader of T.I. Georgia's work, particularly on Ivanishvili and his secret Russian money, I learned a lot from that, Eka, and about Russian influence more broadly from Katya. So thanks, both of you and Elena and Nate for pulling this together. As of 2 months ago, or I should say, ever since 2 months ago, that analysis that we just heard from Eka has now taken on a life beyond just civil society research, because it was prominently cited in USAID's Decluptification Guide, which is a 80-page handbook about how to seize windows of opportunity to dismantle kleptocracies, including a number of examples from Georgia, like police reform led by Katya. As a disclaimer here, again, I chaired the team within USAID of 30 missions, bureaus, and offices that wrote the Decluptification Guide. So I'm biased toward it, and did that while I was on government service leave away from the German Marshall Fund. I'm now back at GMF and not in any way representing USAID or any other institution, just offering my personal views. But I think it's important that an official US government document, which had to be cleared up and down the chain of command across agencies by the White House, promoted heavily by Samantha Power, it made the following statements. First, quote, a recent example of a USAID partner analyzing a closing window of opportunity for decluttification is the work of T.I. Georgia. As it became clear over the past decade that the richest oligarch in Georgia has captured the state, their research, T.I. Georgia's research, examined the impunity of corrupt officials, Georgia's growing economic dependence on Russia, and the oligarchs' secret businesses in Russia, and then citing the report that we just heard about from Eka. Also elsewhere in the USAID report, quote, The window that opened with Georgia's Rose Revolution petered out over time after the 2012 election brought to power an oligarch who made his fortune in Russia, who benefited from Russia raising the specter of military confrontation in the weeks before the 2012 election, who has continued to secretly own businesses in Russia, and who has remained powerful behind the scenes as Georgian law enforcement has stopped seriously pursuing cases of high-level corruption, and who has recleptified the country, end quote. That kind of language might be unsurprising, in a forum like this, or from a think tank in an op-ed, or from Ivanishvili's political opposition, but it rightly raises eyebrows when it's in an official US government document. And so that's why out of the dozens of countries that were referred to in USAID's declarification guide, Georgia was the government that responded with the most apoplectic gesticulation in the days after the guide was published. Also in that same week in September, Mike McFaul and Gar Kasparov wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recommending that the US sanction Ivanishvili unless he stops supporting Putin's war in Ukraine. And in my opinion, yes, that would be the next logical step. The US government has called Ivanishvili a Russian oligarch who captured and recleptified the state. And that's the kind of target that GLOMAG authorities were meant for. If they're not set up, the authorities capable, the GLOMAG authorities set up and capable of pursuing a target like that, the authorities need to, the law or the executive orders implementing them need to be reformed. We could talk more about that. But there is no name that I would personally love to see more in Treasury's annual package of GLOMAG sanctions next month than Ivanishvili, because the interests and the values align. And that's not only because of what he has done and continues to do to Georgia, which is enough in its own right, but also because of the threat to the broader region, as we were hearing about from Katya, including, most importantly, Ukraine, which we will now hear about from our good friend, Elena.
Absolutely, great. Thank you, Josh. I can, for what it's worth, I'll add my name to the list of people calling for GLOMAG sanctions on Ivanishvili as well. As you say, it seems to align in every way, and it's slightly bizarre it hasn't been done already, to my mind. But Elena, sorry to keep you waiting, but how does all this make you feel as a Ukrainian, advocating for the survival of your country? What does the situation in Georgia mean for you?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. Despite I'm not the expert on Georgia, but I would be happy to give my 2 cents on the Ukrainian perspective of the Georgian developments. Basically, what I want to say will very much resemble to what Katya already said, because she is both Georgia, Ukraine expert, has a very good experience, and is one of the reformers and one of the drivers who helped us to move Ukraine towards rule of law and zero corruption country. But in fact, what Russia is doing today towards Ukraine is the colonial, that's the imperialistic war of aggression. And it is a direct consequence of the lack of punishment and accountability for Russian aggression towards Georgia, for Russian aggression towards Ukraine in 2014, Russian war crimes in Syria, etc., etc. I'm not even speaking about their completely scandalous domestic situation. So ever since we started our reforms, since 2014, Georgia has always been a big inspiration for us. Obviously, we had Georgian reformers who helped us driving these things forward. We were very much, using the blueprints, solutions which were tested in Georgia, which we tried to scale up in Ukraine, which is a much larger country, but the approaches are still similar. Both our countries' Euro integration was very important, is still very important to us. I remember very well the visa liberalization action plan and how we had a kind of a healthy competition between our countries on who will first implement, finish up the reforms and get this visa-free regime, and Georgia outplayed us for a few months. That is why it is very depressing to see the rollbacks that are currently happening in Georgia, not only from the perspective as the Ukrainian who is fighting for the survival, but also for somebody who has been dedicated my almost entire professional life to fighting against corruption, building democracy, and all this reforms related issues. And in the today's Russian aggression against Ukraine, there cannot be, I mean, everything is very much white and black. You know, there can't be different shades of gray. There can't be, you know, neutrality. We would like Ukraine, you know, not to lose, but we would also like Russia not to win. And, you know, something not, you know, clear when countries are trying, you know, to, I don't know, be sitting on two chairs simultaneously. Katya was very right that the right thing to do is to fully support Ukrainian victory. And unfortunately, we are not seeing this from the Georgian government, but we are seeing this from Georgian people, and we are extremely grateful for that. Georgian policy towards Ukraine, there are some very concerning news coming from the different reports, and these are not only journalistic reports, these were reports of the intelligence units, if I'm not mistaken, of the Ministry of Defense, also US Treasury, that Georgia is used by Russia to smuggle banned and sanctions goods, mostly dual-use goods, so those which are used by Russian and Belarus armies in order to replenish their stocks with weapons and reinforce their defense. Unfortunately, I mean, those things should be closed. Well, that's something obvious, you know. I've heard a lot, you know, about the economic dependence of Georgia towards Russia. I mean, that's a very big trap. This is the trap a lot of Western countries and European countries have fallen into. We've heard, you know, for years when we were fighting against Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1, that these are purely geopolitical projects which have nothing to do with the economy, but we were not heard by the international partners, unfortunately. And that's something which we are very much calling Georgian colleagues, Georgian reformers, to keep in mind that economic ties with Russia are a very big trap, and you cannot anchor Russia to the civilized world using the economic ties, because this is not working. That's what many decision makers were trying to do for decades, and this failed, unfortunately. We are very saddened to hear about the crossings of borders of hundreds of thousands of Russians into Georgia who were trying to flee from mobilization. This is not only about the national security threats, which I absolutely understand, but this is also about allowing those who can potentially resist illegal mobilization and illegal aggression of Russia towards Ukraine, those who can create domestic resistance to basically simply escape the country. When we were, you know, asked like why you are standing against that, you know, those who flee mobilization, these are just, you know, minus soldiers for Russia. I mean, no, they have 146 million people. They will successfully mobilize millions of Russians in their war against Ukraine. But when we allow to flee hundreds of thousands of people who can potentially protest against this illegal war and who can make change domestically, this is not the right thing to do. So long story short, Georgia has been a very big inspiration for us. We are very sad by the recent developments, and we consider Georgia to to be very important geopolitical partner for us, because if we want to break free from the Russian Empire, we have to do this jointly with you, with Moldova, with all other countries who want to live decently, who want to have rule of law, who want to have human rights and all these issues which are missing in Russia, and I don't know whether they will ever exist there. So we have to unite, we have to support each other, and we have to be moving towards our Euro and NATO integration. And I really wish our Georgian friends success in their domestic fight, because all of these things, they are parts of one big anti-colonial and anti-imperialist crusade.
Well, thank you so much, Elena. I know every Ukrainian's time is really precious at the moment. We're so grateful that you made time to talk to us about that this morning. I wanted to sort of, I guess we're getting towards the end of our time already. It's been so fascinating, it's just sort of whipped by. I can't say it's been, invigorating. It's a pretty concerning situation, but I guess I wanted to start off, we mentioned a bit about, global Magnitsky sanctions as one of the policy options available to US, policymakers in particular. What do you make of I guess I'll direct this at you, Katya, but anyone, I'd love it if others jumped in. To play devil's advocate for a moment, we saw that global Magnitsky sanctions imposed against Plahotniuc and his coterie in Moldova,
Sure.
but he's out of power. Right, he's not in a position to drag Moldova into Russia's orbit. Ivanishvili is still pulling the strings very much in Georgia. How would you respond to what I presume is the pushback you would get from someone at the State Department or whatever when you ask them to do this or you talk to them about this? We don't want to do that because it will antagonize Ivanishvili and Georgia Dream, and then they'll just give up on the West altogether and drag Georgia, straight down into the abyss of Russian influence. How would you respond to that?
I will be very short. So actually, yeah, you're right. So Plahotniuc, I worked in Moldova when Plahotniuc was in power, and I remember how it was absolutely a different situation and very similar to Georgia when, just the Moldovans thought that Plahotniuc can be, almighty and nothing can be, just no obstacles for him to grab the power and to capture the state. But then, because of international partners, because of the involvement of, the very United States and also some of the political opposition, we've seen and we observed that the Plahotniuc escaped. And I think that personally that the sanctions even against him, even, they somehow were, this, late at the later stage, and it damaged a lot, especially the sanctions against Shore damaged a lot some kind of, Maya Sandu's position in Moldova, and actually, but it's important. And finally, they got the sanction. I remember when I talked to my colleagues in Moldova, they were so it was very important for them. So, but let's remember that the Ukrainians sanctioned Mametsashvili and his relative and cousin, as Aika had been saying and mentioning, and his brother, Ivanishvili's brother, and Nazaka, who is an anti-corruption agency, anti-corruption agency. Just they collect all the information and they analyze all the information, and then they put those two names into the sanction list. And it is very much important because Ukrainians got a huge influence right now in international partners, and they have this information. And the third, you're absolutely right. Corrupted society and kleptocracy and the oligarchy in the government create the black holes to avoid the sanctions. Probably we don't have very weighty evidences, how it is done. But I want to mention one very extremely important example. When I had the deputy finance minister at the parliament, and when there was a hearing about Ukraine and avoiding the international sanctions, I asked him, can you show me some kind of document or a regulatory act signed by the Prime Minister of Georgia or by you or whatever, whoever, that regulates the goods that are sanctioned by EU and United States, and they are not coming and going through Larsi and the checkpoints. And he said, no, we do it manually. So of course, when there is when they do it manually, of course, it is important to underline that there might be some holes. Yeah. Third, Absolutely, it's important to underline also that the GD and the government of Georgia use this propaganda like Orban used, and Orban, in Hungary, that everybody who is pro-Ukrainian or, US or Euro parliamentarians or the, Senator Shaheen, for instance, yesterday they slammed Senator Shaheen because she criticized a lot Georgian democracy backslide. Everybody wants to, drag Georgia into the war. This is also the propaganda, which is so much, just can affect on the psychology of the person. So that's why, we talk to our international partners and asking that, okay, let's not punish Georgian people. We understand that 85% of Georgian people, they are pro-European, they're pro-American. Georgians are the most pro-American, just the population ever you can see, in the region. So, but this Treasury Department, Magnitsky Act or individual sanctions to Ivanishvili, it can be a very important warning that, okay, Ivanishvili is not almighty. He can't get away with the things he's doing right now to the democracy, which, Georgian democracy and the international security and regional security. And I think it can be a good leverage for also for a civil society or political opposition, pro-Western opposition and the Georgian people to definitely see that this person is, stands not with in the line of civilized countries. This is kind of very short. I know that we're running out of time.
No, sure. Josh, you have some insight into this. You've worked on sanctions policy. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the challenges that the U.S. government would face and their ability to do something like sanction Ivanishvili, there's two issues: the technical and the diplomatic. So you raise the diplomatic, the fact that unlike Plahotniuc and Shor, Ivanishvili is in power in Georgia. So certainly for that reason, the way it works within the U.S. government is the embassy in Tbilisi would never be in favor of doing that. Not just Tbilisi, the embassy in any country was never going to be in favor of and advocating for sanctioning top officials in that country. It has to, the call and order has to come down from top U.S. officials who are also focused on Ukraine and the region, focused on Biden's counter kleptocracy strategy. And then, have the call be to gather up the evidence and see whether it stands up. They would, I would argue that the relationship with Ivanishvili and Georgia is already broken and producing so much damage that I don't really understand what you exactly lose there. And there are governments that we have, including recently, used corruption, GLOMAG sanctions on current senior officials, whether it's in Guatemala or Liberia. So it is possible. That's the diplomatic. But then when you do then have to look at the evidence, that could be an even greater challenge. And the issue there is that the way that the GLOMAG legislation and the implementing executive orders set out the requirements for the evidence, first of all, it has to be evidence within the past 5 years. And that evidence has to show an explicit quid pro quo. It's this sort of like antiquated Western oriented. It doesn't understand how like mobster type kleptocracies work, but the way it's set up, you have to demonstrate essentially the transaction, what official favor did Ivanishvili, what office did he use, and what official favor did he provide to this corrupt person who then, and then what was the exchange for that? What was the bribe money and how did it go? And exactly trace all of the money and document exactly when they came to this agreement about the corrupt transaction. It's a very high threshold for Treasury OFAC to clear, and that's very problematic. So with that, it's essentially among us here a question for Eka about, because she's done the leading work on bringing out that evidence. Does it exist?
It's a very good question. So yeah, again, so it's very difficult for us to find particular information and the documents about the transactions and all that. So what we see here, it's a classical kleptocracy. Like, you see the state institutions in favor of Ivanishvili. And I can't recall any of this except for the public defender that can resist to the desires of Mr. Ivanishvili. Of course, we have cases when the huge land plots were given to Mr. Ivanishvili, and there might be some problems. So there was no competitor there, and he privatized this and all these kind of things. So, but the main thing is here again. So he has his loyal people on key positions in the government. So, and these individuals are loyal to him personally, even not to the ruling party. I would say some of them are his personal bodyguards. Some of them were his assistants. Some of them were his I don't know, the others. I would say the servant, the very close circle of his, people serving him. And this is very problematic. What we can also say is that there are, of course, companies who having some shares in offshore, and these companies are winning, some of them are winning the state tenders, and then these companies are donating to the ruling party. So that's also kind of scheme that widely used, but not only his companies, but there are many companies who would get the state contract and then donate the particular amount of money to the ruling party. And that's why ruling party has 2.5 times more donation and income than all other opposition parties together. So when having this, and also the media plays the crucial role, that all this propaganda is there. I would say that the key media, which has the leading role when it comes to the anti-West propaganda attacks on the ambassadors and all this media is owned by the U.S. citizen, by the way. Strange thing, but this is happening here. So that's why, to resist to this. And very often, the people say that what the Georgian public should do something, but we are trying. But when person owns 1/3 of the country's GDP, and you don't have the mechanisms, you don't have anything. The political parties are very fragmented and weak. The critical medias are under the investigation, and no one helps them. I should say that they face difficulties with funding, and the donors are not giving them money. This is also what we should mention. So in this situation, it's very difficult to do something, and especially to find the proofs. Of course, we have relations with our partners outside, especially with the investigative groups who did many things, especially when it comes to the wrongdoings of oligarchs in Ukraine, right? So we have the connections with them, but it is it's still difficult to find the proofs, and that's why it's important for the Treasury Department to play the role there, maybe to give us the hints where, and we of course provide them with additional information. And it's not the problem, but again, so it's difficult to find, although of course we have concrete proofs on particular people around Ivanishvili, his circle, and maybe it might be the first step just to look at his circle, these individuals, and then expand it. Maybe that's the solution, and maybe we can start with this.
That is a good place. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I could keep talking about this for a lot longer, and there are a lot more options we haven't even started to talk about yet. But thank you all so much for your time today. I'm hearing that Georgia really is on the brink this time. I'm hearing that it needs a lot more Western engagement, particularly from U.S. leadership, to help drive back this tide of Russian influence, and to hold accountable the leadership and Georgia Dream under Bidzina Ivanishvili that has brought it to this situation. And I'm also hearing that there are really, really concerning implications for Ukraine's fight for freedom, not just in the kind of soft financial, cultural sort of political, power type world that I usually work on with the kleptocracy stuff. But in terms of hardcore sanctions evasion to get, drones and other hardware that through to Ukraine so that, Russians can kill Ukrainians. And that's really scary. And that's something that the US should be taking much more notice of as far as I'm concerned. But Katya, Ika, Josh, and Elena, I want to thank you all for your time today. This is a conversation I want to reconvene periodically to make sure that we keep the pressure up and we keep our eyes on Georgia as well as Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.